Welcome to Lecture 6. In this lecture, we will close the circle to examine a critically important part of the American judicial process, namely, what happens when a justice is installed in the Marble Palace. Over the course of the past few lectures, we have seen, especially qualitatively, how important political considerations are to a justice when he or she is contemplating retirement. We've seen how much presidents try to minimize uncertainty in the nomination process, carefully considering a Supreme Court nominee's expressed ideology, both to maximize the president and the nominee's ideological compatibility, and keeping an eye on the Senate toward the confirmation process. And we've seen how the Senate, particularly since the late 1980s, put a huge emphasis on the ideological persuasion of a justice. You only need to open a newspaper or turn on the television during a judicial nomination and confirmation fight to see that the battle can be described almost entirely by the bitter ideological and partisan divide. So basically, it seems like ideology is the end-all and be-all, right? That it explains everything. But do presidents actually get what they bargained for? Is the Senate right to draw battle lines with the president over the ideology of a potential justice during the selection and confirmation stages? In other words, the overarching question that motivates our discussion today is simply, once a justice is confirmed by the Senate and ascends to the Supreme Court, how does he or she behave? Is that justice's ideology stable over time, or do justices change their mind during their tenure on the court? In short, do presidents and senators get what they want? And if they don't, what are the implications for the selection and nomination and confirmation stages? When President Bush nominated Harriet Miers in 2005, he made it clear that he believed in her conservative credentials. He famously said, "I know her heart, I know what she believes. She knows exactly the kind of judge I'm looking for, and I know exactly the kind of judge she'll be." He was entirely confident that Miers was not going to change, that 20 years from now she'll be the same person with the same philosophy. Bush was nothing short of certain that a shared conservative ideological commitment with his nominee would help create his lasting legacy through the Supreme Court. While Miers eventually withdrew her nomination, the confidence that Bush had in her ideological stability is not uncommon. In fact, presidents, journalists, court watchers, and scholars alike have long assumed that a nominee's ideological preferences at the time of confirmation will remain stable throughout that justice's tenure on the court. For example, during his confirmation hearings, editors from both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times offered predictions about Samuel Alito's future on the court. The New York Times proclaimed that Alito would be, quote, "a surefire vote against abortion rights." Likewise, the Wall Street Journal announced, "What we're confident Judge Alito won't do is join the court's liberal wing on cases such as Lawrence versus Texas and intrude willy-nilly into social matters best left to legislatures to solve." This emphasis on ideology during the nomination and confirmation processes is not surprising. Indeed, it's clear that beliefs about how a nominee will behave once he or she assumes a seat on the court are critically important to the president, the Senate, the interest groups that lobby for or against confirmation, and to the American public at large. And there seems to be good reason, at least intuitively, that we would expect a nominee's jurisprudential ideology at the time of confirmation to remain stable. For one thing, by the time they get to the Supreme Court, the vast majority of justices have had a long career in the law. On the current court, for example, with the exception of Elena Kagan, all of the justices served as federal appellate court judges for several years. Additionally, many justices, like Breyer and Ginsburg, were law professors before joining the court. It is plausible that throughout their careers then, that the justices would develop and refine a legal doctrine that would not be susceptible to change once they join the Supreme Court. And indeed, much behavioral evidence bolsters this intuition. When William Rehnquist was nominated in 1971, a New York Times editorial called him, quote, "a Goldwater conservative with a brilliant professional background." Likewise, 20 years earlier, the press proclaimed William Brennan's liberalism, and indeed, Rehnquist demonstrated commitment to judicial conservatism, while Brennan was a consistent liberal during his tenure. Recall that the ideology scores that we talked about in the last lecture create a measure of a Supreme Court nominee's ideology at the time of appointment by quantifying newspaper editorials through a process called content analysis. On the x-axis, this graph displays the aggregate assessment of newspaper editors' ideological assessments ranging from very liberal on the left to very conservative on the right. On the vertical or y-axis, this graph shows the actual percentage of conservative votes cast by a justice over the course of his or her career. So the higher number here corresponds to a higher percentage of liberal votes. That is precisely the pattern we see here. Justices labeled as very liberal, like Brennan, Marshall, and Fortas, cast the fewest number of conservative votes throughout their careers on the Supreme Court. Justices labeled as very conservative by newspaper editorials like Rehnquist, Alito, and Scalia cast the highest percentage of conservative votes, whereas the moderate justices fell somewhere in the middle. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was labeled as a slightly left of center nominee, and she reaches liberal decisions in approximately 60% of the court's cases, which is exactly what we should expect. Similarly, Justice Kennedy was labeled as slightly right of center as a nominee, and he guessed conservative votes about 60% of the time. There are, however, a few visible exceptions to the pattern. Justices Harry Blackmun and Justice David Souter, for example, were labeled as relatively conservative nominees, yet both men cast conservative votes in well below 50% of the court's cases during their appointment. Conversely, Justice John Marshall Harlan was labeled as a relatively liberal nominee, yet he supported the conservative position more than half the time. Yet overall, the justice's original ideological assessment seems to be a good indicator of the justice's behavior post-confirmation. But despite the apparent relationship between a justice's ideology at the time of confirmation and their overall voting behavior during their service on the court, there are a couple of reasons to believe justice's ideology is not stable over time. Specifically, this graph lumps all of the votes for all of the cases during a justice's time on the court. While this approach is valuable for giving us an overall picture, it misses the nuances of how a justice votes in a given Supreme Court term, or how voting behavior might change across terms and across time. A couple of early studies in political science disaggregated the votes of the justices, examining the percentage of ideological votes cast each term, rather than as a single overall percentage or snapshot. The disaggregated analysis provided initial evidence that nearly 2/3 of justices grew increasingly liberal, conservative, or shifted between the two over the course of their careers. Additionally, thorough case studies lend support to this type of ideological movement. Perhaps the most well-known example is Harry Blackmun's apparent ideological drift to the left. His jurisprudential shift is remarkable. He went from being a supporter of the death penalty to an opponent, from an advocate of states' rights to a proponent of federal power, from an unwillingness to recognize sex discrimination in litigation to a full-fledged supporter of women's rights. While these early studies cast a bit of doubt on the stability of judicial preferences over time, such approaches were plagued with methodological problems. The biggest problem was that the early studies did not account for the content of the litigation in the cases before the court, raising the concern that the measurement scheme might not be valid. Quite simply, the shifts in voting from liberal to conservative or vice versa might be a result of changes in case content rather than in a shift of the justice's underlying ideological jurisprudential preferences. And so the debate remained unsettled, with some evidence suggesting that justice's ideology was relatively stable, and other admittedly flawed evidence indicated ideological movement on the court. The debate about whether or not justices drift ideologically is not just a concern for nerdy academics like me. Indeed, it holds interesting consequences for the entire nomination and confirmation process. If all justices act like Justice Blackmun, for example, would a president want to weigh a nominee's ideology so heavily during the appointment phase? Probably not. On the other hand, if justices are stable and committed ideologues, we could easily see a justification for thoroughly vetting a nominee's ideological predisposition prior to nomination. There are similar consequences for confirmation voting in the Senate and interest group participation during the entire process. Thus, to settle the debate, it was clear that we needed a new measure of policy preferences to capture a justice's ideology once he or she is on the court. To develop a new, more valid measure of judicial ideology, political scientists and statisticians Andrew Martin and Kevin Quinn relied on something called item response or latent trait theory, which was developed in educational psychology in the 1950s. In its original formulation, item response theory gave way to a complicated statistical model that used standardized tests to determine a latent or hidden trait. In educational testing, the latent quality of interest is intelligence or aptitude. As latent response theory gained traction, it quickly spread to other fields in the social sciences, like sociology, communication, and political science. For instance, to develop standardized ideology scores for members of Congress, political scientists analyzed and scaled voting behavior for each member, assuming that the latent trait in voting behavior is the ideological persuasion of the congressman or woman. Similarly, the application to judicial behavior uses voting on the court to tap into the underlying ideological preferences of the justices, using something called the Martin-Quinn Bayesian dynamic ideal point model, which sounds very complicated, and it is. Indeed, it's a very labor-intensive and mathematically sophisticated measurement scheme. So let's put this in basic terms. This approach uses a spatial model of voting on the court, where justices have the choice between two policy alternatives, to affirm or reverse the lower court decision, for example. This approach assumes that a justice will vote for the alternative that is closest to her ideal outcome in the policy space. Aggregating voting behavior in a given term, then, yields an ideal point for each justice that we can use to study ideological drift. Importantly, this approach also controls for the variation in case content, thus overcoming the measurement deficiencies of past approaches. In short, the Martin-Quinn scores provide a valid measure for each justice in each term that is comparable across individuals and through time. Okay, now that we have a valid measure of a justice's ideology, let's return to the substantive question. We learned that presidents go to great lengths to ensure that their judicial nominees are their ideological allies. Now we want to see if the nominees behave according to plan once they get to the court. The graph shown here plots the predicted ideal point of the nominees derived from the newspaper editorial assessment on the x-axis against the actual ideal point captured by the Martin-Quinn estimation technique in their first year of the justice's tenure on the court on the y-axis. Since we can reasonably assume that newspaper editorials accurately capture the senators and the president's belief about the ideology of the nominee at the time, this graph illustrates that the President and the Senate can have some confidence in their beliefs about how the justice will behave on the court in his or her first year on the court. Notice that the dots are clustered closely along the line. The closer the justice is to this line, the better the initial ideological assessment corresponds to the justice's actual behavior on the court. So, for example, notice that in his first term, we see that Justice Blackmun, who was pegged as very conservative, did indeed vote a conservative hardline in his first term. We see similar results for moderate Justices White and Ginsburg and liberal Justice Marshall. Thus, initially, in the first year, it looks like the President and the Senate get exactly what they expected. Liberal justices vote liberally, conservative justices vote conservatively, and moderates somewhere in the middle. But that's not the end of the story. In fact, 10 years after appointment, the picture changes. Like the previous graph, this plots a justice's predicted ideal point against his actual revealed ideological preferences on the court. You'll notice, unlike the previous graph, the points here are much more scattered. They're not just clustered along this regression line. This indicates that there is significant ideological movement away from the initial prediction. For example, Justice Scalia moved far above the regression line, indicating a sizable move in a more conservative direction by his 10th year on the court, which is what this graph is, a snapshot of justices who've been on the court for 10 years. Justice Ginsburg, who voted almost exactly how we predicted she would in her first term, voted much more liberally in her 10th year on the Supreme Court. These aggregate patterns offer evidence that, at least in their first term, justices align with the president's and the Senate's expectations. But by the justice's 10th term, many justices have drifted from their ideological starting point. So this graph shows that at the aggregate level, many of the justices drift ideologically over their first decade on the Supreme Court. Now let's turn to consider how individual justices shift their doctrinal preferences over time. We'll look specifically at 26 justices that served on the court for at least 10 years from 1937 to the early 2000s. Note that this means that we're not looking at the behavior of recent nominees like Robert, Alito, Sotomayor, Kagan, or Gorsuch, and we also miss a few former justices like Abe Fortas, who sat on the Supreme Court for less than a decade. Of the 26 justices that served more than 10 years on the court from 1937 to 2005, only 4 of them have remained constant. 2 of these 4 were ideologically extreme when they entered the court and remained consistently ideologically extreme throughout their tenure on the court. Justice Murphy on the left has been consistently liberal. Justice Thomas on the right has been consistently conservative. Compared to Murphy and Thomas, Justice Stewart began as a moderate and maintained a consistently moderate record while he was on the Supreme Court. Similarly, Justice Breyer is always a little bit left of center and has voted a relatively moderate way, although always a little bit to the left. Nearly half of the 26 justices drifted to the left, becoming increasingly more liberal the longer they served on the court. As we've noted numerous times, Justice Blackmun did a near 180, starting as a conservative justice and ending his tenure as a solidly liberal member of the court. Justice Kennedy, on the other hand, moved slowly but gradually to the left. While he stayed an ideological conservative and pillar of the right, former Chief Justice Rehnquist became increasingly moderate throughout his 34 years on the court. Indeed, he began as almost the most conservative justice in this sample, and he ended his tenure as a more moderate conservative, still right of center, but not as ideologically extreme as, say, Scalia or Thomas. What these figures make clear is that there is certainly some variation in how justices evolve their doctrinal preferences on the court. Some, like O'Connor, Powell, and Kennedy, inch slowly to the left, while others, like Blackmun, Souter, and Marshall, march steadily leftward, while others, like Stevens and Brennan, seem to maintain stable preferences for a while, followed by a steep and drastic ideological change. Of the 26 justices serving 10 years or more from 1937 to 2005, 7 of them trended rightward, becoming increasingly conservative as they served on the nation's highest court. While it's true that more justices became increasingly liberal, it's interesting to see that some justices did indeed drift to the right. Popular commentary often emphasizes that the justices become increasingly liberal. The ideological shifts of Justice O'Connor and Blackmun, for example, are well known and highly publicized. We hear far less often, however, about justices who move to the right. The rightward patterns we observe here are similar to those that move to the left. Some justices move quickly, while others move more gradually. Some take extraordinary leaps to the right, essentially reversing their doctrinal preferences, while others simply become more consistently conservative over time. Take Justice Frankfurter, for example, who began his career in the 1938 term as a slightly left-of-center justice situated very close to the median position on the court. But by the start of his second term, however, Frankfurter quickly moves to the right. By the end of his tenure, Frankfurter was second only to John Harlan as the court's most conservative extreme member. You should take a few minutes to explore these graphics on your own, since we don't need to go through all 26 justices together. But you should see here, for instance, that Justice Scalia started as a conservative ideologue and has only become consistently more conservative throughout his tenure on the court. Finally, 3 of the 26 justices exhibit what can be called exotic policy preferences, trending both to the left and right at various points in their careers. Justice Douglas demonstrates the most drastic of this type of movement. Douglas started as a liberal justice in 1939, and he quickly became more moderate, moving to the right, sitting comfortably just left of center for nearly a decade, before sharply turning back to extreme liberalism. In fact, for his last 2 decades on the court, Douglas was the most ideologically extreme liberal voting member on the court. Let's bring this full circle and return to our motivating question. Do presidents get what they want? This is a really tough research question to answer. In fact, only in the past decade, thanks to methodological innovations, have we been able to assess the ideological drift of the justices on the Supreme Court. The empirical evidence suggests that presidents can be relatively confident about a nominee's behavior post-confirmation for at least the first term on the court. However, 85% of the justices we considered here today strayed from their original ideological predisposition throughout their tenure on the court, with some moving to the left, others to the right, and a few couldn't seem to make up their minds, moving both left and right at various points. Additionally, when we talk about whether a president gets what he wants, it's important to recognize that some changes in judicial behavior are more troublesome to a president's legacy than are others. For example, Reagan would likely be unconcerned that his conservative appointee, Nino Scalia, became more conservative than he bargained for. But Bush Sr. would likely be very dismayed that David Souter moved so quickly to the left. Notably, too, some ideological shifts result in major doctrinal changes having significant impact on how the court renders decisions, like Justice Blackmun's switch from the right to the left, Justice Souter's switch from the right to the left, while others have less sizable effects. So in practical terms, why do we care whether justices exhibit ideological drift? Well, for one thing, it has significant implications for the appointment process. Again, we know that presidents spend a lot of time searching for the right nominee. Sometimes the right nominee has nothing to do with the ideological preferences of the president. Indeed, President Herbert Hoover selected Benjamin Cardozo to fill Oliver Wendell Holmes's seat, knowing full well that Cardozo was a Democrat and did not share his ideological values. Hoover selected Cardozo not because of ideology or partisanship, but because he felt Cardozo was an extraordinarily well-qualified judge with a distinguished legal mind. Similarly, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower appointed liberal Democrat Bill Brennan to the court not because Brennan shared his ideological values, but because Brennan was a Catholic and Eisenhower hoped to gain favor with that critical bloc of voters. While these exceptions stand out, they are certainly exceptions to the rule, for the most part because presidents search long and hard for nominees that share their policy preferences in hopes of creating a legacy that outlasts their presidency. However, since so many justices drift from their ideological starting points, this implies that perhaps those exceptions to the rule might be smarter, that perhaps presidents would be better off focusing on short-term electoral gains rather than on long-term legacy building, which may or may not come to fruition. As you review the lecture slides for today, you should make sure that you can explain whether or not presidents get what they want out of a Supreme Court nominee. You should be able to describe the general patterns of ideological drift on the Supreme Court. You're not responsible for all 26 of the justices, but be able to understand how many justices, for example, moved to the left, how many moved to the right, how many were exotic, how many were stable. You should analyze when ideological drift is meaningful, noting, for example, that there's a significant difference between Justice Blackmun's reversal in his doctrinal preferences as opposed to Scalia's increasing conservatism, which didn't actually change the court's output. You should be able to construct an argument about if and how these results should or shouldn't impact the selection confirmation stages. Do you think that it's likely to have an impact? Why or why not? If you can answer those questions, do those things, then you've gotten what I hope you've gotten out of this lecture for today.